All right, if you would open up to Acts chapter 23. Acts chapter 23. I want you to look at verse 11 because I want you to see this promise. And to understand as Paul goes through this series of events, and they really seem to start here at the end of 22, and this unraveling of details and travel through imprisonment, through other things, to really see that God does not leave Paul without hope. He puts these things in front of him not only to give him hope, but to also give him direction. Acts chapter 23, just verse 11. Says, but on the night immediately following, which he had just gone before the Sanhedrin council before here, these first 10 verses, but verse 11, but on the night immediately following, the Lord stood at his side and said, take courage, for as you have solemnly witnessed to my cause at Jerusalem, so you must witness at Rome also. So here is God giving this direction, the Lord giving this direction to Paul, to say, you've been here in Jerusalem, he's just come through another meeting together with the Sanhedrin, and to go, you are going to be my witness in Rome. From that one statement, Paul knows, I'm going to get out of Jerusalem alive. He has direction to know where I need to be heading. And yet, as things continue through Acts 23, you've already covered some of these things. Here he is, and then to find out that there is, and he doesn't know it at first, some people after that meeting with the Sanhedrin, if you remember, it became divided because Paul brought up the resurrection of Jesus. And the Sanhedrin council is made up of Pharisees who do believe in resurrection, Sadducees who do not believe in a resurrection, and Paul kind of used that to his advantage to talk about the resurrection of Jesus, knowing that just causes a big division between the two of them, and it's as if Paul gets to just kind of go, and I'll leave that with you. Because then the focus turns away from Paul in terms of dealing with what's really going on. And then the following night, Paul gets this message from the Lord, and the people there in Jerusalem, the religious Jews, over 40 of them put themselves under an oath, even under a curse, to say, we will not eat and we will not drink until we have killed Paul. And realize, are they genuine in this? They are genuine in their concern. I've always wondered, did they keep their oath? I just wonder. I know the way my mind wants me to think. But you look at them and go, it's interesting. You make a big old oath. Remember what Jesus said about oaths? He says, don't swear by heaven, it's not yours. Don't swear by earth, it's not yours. You can't even swear by a hair on your head. And to say, here's why. Don't be stupid. He says, you only control the things you control. And their motives are certainly wicked and evil. Then, of course, God provides. It's not until Acts 23 they even know that Paul has a sister. And then to learn that he also has a nephew. And the nephew finds out about this plot, and the nephew comes to Paul, and Paul tells him, you go talk to the commander, to the chiliarch. And we've been dealing with him, this chiliarch, all the way through since the previous couple of chapters, but you've never known his name until you get here to chapter 23. He goes and he tells the commander, and I want you to just look at verse 21 and 22. He says, well, actually 20. He says, and he said, the Jews have agreed to ask you to bring Paul down tomorrow to the council, to the Sanhedrin again there in Jerusalem, as though they were going to inquire somewhat more thoroughly about him. So do not listen to them, for more than 40 of them are lying in wait for him, who have bound themselves under a curse not to eat or drink until they slay him. And now they are ready and waiting for the promise from you. So the commander let the young man go. This, of course, is Paul's nephew. He says, instructing him, tell no one that you have notified me of these things. Now, I want you to think about the nephew for a moment. Your job is just to give the report. You don't get to affect what happens. So oftentimes we see about a desperate situation and we go, now here's what I want you to do and here's what I think you should do. And to go, he just says, I want you to know about this plot against him. I want you to know about these more than 40 men who put themselves under a curse. And can you imagine their hostility toward Paul? To go, God, may you curse us if we eat or drink before Paul is slayed. Do you see the bitterness? Do you see the jealousy? Do you see the ignorance? That's kind of a recipe for disaster, isn't it? And yet, here's God going to take care of Paul, even though he's still under the control of this commander. Now, verse 23. And he called to him 2 of the centurions. And remember, the commander is a chiliarch. That means he's over 1,000 men. So do the quick math. How many centurions are under him? 10, right? Because if they're 100 apiece, and he's over 1,000 men total, you got 10 centurions. He calls 2 of the centurions. He said, get 200 soldiers. That's pretty easy if you're a centurion, and you have 2 of them. Get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour of the night to proceed to Caesarea with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. Now think about that group.
Is that in addition to that 200, or is that all inclusive?
Whenever you look at what's here, get 200 soldiers, and then he says, with 70 horsemen and 200 spearmen. So it makes you think in terms of, we're dealing with 470 soldiers, right?
They're going to be surrounding Paul.
Now, I want you to think about this. Has God taken care of Paul? I mean, to think 470 men, and you think to protect one man from a group of men who's only about 40 plus. I mean, you think about even 40 times 12 gets you to 480. This is 470. You think if you have the enemy outnumbered roughly 11 or 12 to 1, do you like your odds? Militarily, at least. Now, here they are. What is this really? Is this not the grace of God? What does this tell you about His grace?
They're also bringing them out for Paul.
All right, you're getting a verse ahead, Juanita. Now, don't get too far ahead yet. But I want you to see how abundant is the grace of God. Now, here's the flip side. That doesn't mean that God's going to all of a sudden go, all right, Paul, you're free to go. Sometimes we think grace should be everything should just fall the way that we imagine to be best. But that's not the case, is it? And if that's really what it was, we'd be a very fleshly people, wouldn't we? But you notice, Paul already knows, you're going to witness in Rome too. Here's the protection. And I want you to notice, get 200 soldiers ready by the 3rd hour. You know what time of day that is? 9 o'clock at night. He says, you get them ready. We're going to leave at 9. Then, he says, 70 horsemen. He says, 200 spearmen. You talk about being ready. Why this big response to Paul? You know what's really going on behind this. Here's the Lord at hand and protecting Paul. What is motivating this commander to do this? Because it's not as if, his nephew comes up and says there's a big plot. What's in this for the commander to go, why should I truly protect Paul? He's a Roman citizen. And you have to remember, at the time, I know we think about citizenship in a completely different way than the way they did. I mean, in all the Roman Empire, there might be 5,000 citizens. Does that give you an idea about how exclusive it is to be a Roman citizen? You know, if people got killed and they weren't Roman citizens, they didn't even investigate what happened. If you were a Roman citizen and you were killed, they're going to find out what happened and who did it.
But didn't Paul have to tell them that he was born in Rome? Was his family Roman?
You didn't have to be born in Rome in order to be a Roman citizen. He did tell the commander, he says, I was born a citizen, which tells you there's a couple different ways that can happen, but either both of his parents were citizens, which is the most likely way, but there's some other ways, and I'm not going to take you through all those weeds. But looking at it to go, the commander goes, look, I'm protecting a citizen. And the commander's a citizen himself, even though he bought his with money. That's back in the previous chapters. So here they are, and to go, here's the commander. Now, who put the commander in that place? The Lord did. Sometimes we miss that. The Lord puts people right where He wants them to be for what His will is. I'm not saying that's for every commander in the Roman Empire, but to go for this situation with Paul. Then, verse 24, they were also to provide mounts to put Paul on and bring him safely to Felix the governor. Now, Felix is up in Caesarea, which is about 60 to 80 miles away, depending on how you travel there. And so, I mean, to be put on a mount, I mean, to get your own horse, that sure makes this trip a whole lot better for Paul's sake. And they provide that. Then, verse 25. And he wrote a letter having this form. He's the commander. And in verse 26, you're finally going to get his name. And to realize this is the same commander that's been dealing with this whole situation all the way back in Acts chapter 21 when it started up, whenever Paul had been not quite arrested by the Jews in the temple, but whenever he saw there was a disturbance, this is the commander that came up and found him. So he's been with him all this time for these last few days. Then, notice this letter. And I want you to think, if you're a commander, and I know you've already read ahead, I'm sure, but I just want you to kind of think out loud. If you're a commander and you kept a Roman citizen from probably being killed in the temple or outside of the temple, and you want to send this information to the governor who's over Judea, the Roman governor, and his name is Felix, what information do you want Felix to know? A, he's a Roman citizen. What else? Why am I sending him? Because you're going to notice the commander's not going to go up with this group. He's going to send them on. And he's not going to go himself. I mean, this is a commander. This is what he does. You don't command people to do things and then go do it yourself. So, now listen to what he writes. And here's his name, verse 26. Claudius Lysias, that's our commander that we've been dealing with all this time, and you finally get a name to go with it. So, you don't have to call him the commander anymore. Now we can call him Lysias, or Claudius Lysias. It says, Claudius Lysias, to the most excellent governor Felix, greetings. How are we starting? That's right. You are the governor and I am not, and I want you to know I appreciate you. You are most excellent. Some people would say buttered him up perhaps, but anyway, I'm not sure if that was a term just yet. Verse 27. When this man was arrested by the Jews and was about to be slain by them, I came up to them with the troops and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman. Notice how he describes the situation. He says, the Jews were about to kill him. I recognize, and he kind of makes this sound a little fishy, like, I found out he's a Roman citizen, so I spared him. Is that exactly what happened? No. They were getting ready to stretch him out to scourge him, and then somebody said, you know what you're about to do? And he goes, oh, he's a Roman citizen. Well, stop this. But anyway, this is what he communicates, which tells you communication isn't always 100%. And I also kind of want to show you, too, even though he is an instrument that God is using, does that mean he's flawless? No. So realize that just in general. Just because the Lord uses somebody doesn't mean that they're going to do everything in their life just the way that God would desire. But yet, the Lord's still using them. Verse 28. He says, in wanting to ascertain the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council. Now, is that really how it went? Not really. But he says, I took him before their own council, which of course is the Sanhedrin. He says, and I wanted to find out what was going on. He says, I brought him down to their council, and the council met there at the temple on the southern side of it. Verse 29. And I found him to be accused over questions about their law, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Here's another aspect that Felix would want to know. This man is not there over anything that's political or anything that is military. This is just about their own religious beliefs. Because what does Felix, the Roman governor, really care about? Government. He says, if this guy is kind of going to bring in some kind of coup against the government, I want to know about that. If he's going to start up some military problem, I want to know about that. But Claudius Lysias, the commander, tells him, this doesn't have anything to do with those things. This is just about a dispute among their own religion. Now, here's what he brings up. Just questions about their law. Notice how he puts it. Their law. Doesn't say about our Roman law. He says this is a Jewish thing. Then, but under no accusation deserving death or imprisonment. Do you see in Claudius Lysias saying he really shouldn't even be in jail or imprisoned? Like he hasn't done anything wrong against the Roman Empire. Then verse 30, he says, when I was informed that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, also instructing his accusers to bring charges against him before you. He says, and here's the reason why I'm sending him to you. There's a plot to kill him. And he doesn't tell him all the details about there's 40 men and they put themselves under a curse if they don't eat or drink. They're not going to eat or drink until they die. He doesn't give him all that information. He just says, plot against him, and that's why I'm sending him to you. And to go, I sent him at once. And you might be going, well, that makes sense. If you're going to leave at 9 o'clock at night, maybe let's put this into our day and time. What has to happen for you to decide to leave at 9 o'clock at night when you weren't planning to go anywhere at noon? Undercover, emergency, something extreme, right? And to go, here they are. Remember, there aren't headlights on horses. So for them to travel at night is a big deal. And the reason, why? He's a Roman citizen. And some of his own Jewish people were going to kill him because of disputes about their own law. And so whenever I heard about this plot, I loaded up everybody and I told them, you get him safely to Felix. So realize whenever Felix reads this, it means that they're already standing in Caesarea. It's not like this message goes before them. So you imagine being Felix, you see 471 humans pulling up in front of your residence and going, what's this all about? And then whoever, one of the centurions, hands this letter over to Felix. And then Felix reads it and he goes, oh, okay, this is what this is about. So, but before that can happen, they got to get there. Verse 31. So the soldiers, in accordance with their orders, took Paul and brought him by night to Antipatris. Now, Antipatris is about the halfway point. It's not the direct route necessarily from Jerusalem to Caesarea, which is where they're going. It is kind of a, we would say, do you want to take the country roads or do you want to take the highway? They take the path that is a lot easier to travel at night, and they're leaving really at this point to go. They know one thing for sure. How long can these 40 men go without food and still survive? Well, marching all night. They cover about 28, 30 miles. Antipatris is about the halfway point. They really, from Jerusalem, they head out west toward the Mediterranean Sea, and then they start heading up north, a little bit inland from the coast, and they're making their way up. If you know where Joppa is on a map on the coast, it's kind of east, northeast is where Antipatris is. And so in being there, he says, brought him by night to Antipatris. So they cover like 30 miles before daybreak. You think about traveling by night, I mean, some of them are on horses, but not everybody. Paul's on a horse. You think about these other 400 soldiers going, we don't have horses. But they don't think anything about it. This is just their military service. Then, verse 32, but the next day, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, he says, they returned to the barracks. It's only the 70 horsemen that take him from Antipatris up to Caesarea. So whenever Felix actually sees the group, there's only 71 of them, not 471. So here they are. It says, leaving the horsemen to go on with him, they returned to the barracks. So there's the spearmen, there's the other 200 soldiers too. They go back to Jerusalem. Verse 33. When these had come to Caesarea and delivered the letter to the governor, they also presented Paul to him. When he had read it, he asked from what province he was, and when he learned that he was from Cilicia, think about southern modern-day Turkey, where Tarsus was. Verse 35. He said, I will give you a hearing after your accusers arrive also, giving orders for him to be kept in Herod's praetorium. He says, you know what? There's going to be a hearing. It's not going to be right now. He says, it's going to be a little bit. And notice, what is Felix waiting for? Yeah, the accusers. He says, those that were there at the Sanhedrin. He says, they're going to have to come up. It's not like you can decide a case only hearing one side. Felix is not just kind of flying by the seat of his pants. So he knows better. He's a governor. He's like, when your accusers come, then we'll have this. Andrea.
Something doesn't say, but could you imagine what it would have been like if you would have had all 470 people searching this place?
Right. You'd have been glad that they were Romans. If they were in any other colors, it'd have been trouble. Just to give you an idea. And notice, it says Herod's praetorium. It's the governor's residence is what it is.
Private residence.
Right. And for what it's worth, praetorium was an old term about, it's where the highest ranking military official, it was his tent on the battlefield. But later on, since they weren't in tents so much anymore, it became kind of the governor's residence. So that's just the word praetorium anytime you see it through the New Testament. So here they are. You can see they're taking care of Paul. Paul's a Roman citizen, so he kind of gets some special treatment in one way. And here he is, and they're just waiting for the accusers to show up. Chapter 24. Now notice, they made that trip basically in less than a 24-hour day. Chapter 24, verse 1. After 5 days, the high priest Ananias came down with some soldiers, with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. You notice the accusers, remember what Claudius Lysias told Felix? I let the accusers know that they're going to have to come up and give their charges or to bring charges against him before you. So in whatever way that gets communicated, it wasn't the same letter, but Claudius Lysias makes sure of that. I hope you see that Claudius Lysias is definitely diligent, if not anything. And so here they come, and realize it takes them all 5 days to get there. So 5 days, and I just want to make a little footnote. It says high priest Ananias. This is the third Ananias that we've seen in the book of Acts, if you remember. The first Ananias is of Ananias and Sapphira, and that Ananias died by the hands of the Lord because of Ananias and Sapphira's lying to the Spirit of God in their debacle, in their sin. The second Ananias that we ran into, do you remember him? Right. The Lord used this Ananias to go in and speak to Saul and lay his hands on him, and he would receive his sight back, and then Saul would be converted. So Ananias is very useful there. The name Ananias literally means the grace of God, which is a little ironic for Ananias who dies for lying. What did he do with the grace of God? Trampled it, and he died. You think about the Ananias that comes to Saul, grace of God on its finest display with Saul being converted, one who had even murdered God's own people. Now you come to a high priest named Ananias, and this Ananias is corrupt. You've already seen that whenever in earlier chapters. This is the one that called in and said, yeah, just smack him. And Paul says, you're going to try me by the law, and in violation of the law, going to have me hit? Which tells you, this Ananias, who's the high priest, is not working off of true spiritual things. He's a Jew, of course. And he's all, just to let you know, he's also a Sadducee. Because that's the lineage of the high priest, is they're Sadducees. Anyway. So, Ananias comes down, different Ananias. Don't associate him with the one that went to Saul. And of course, he's not back from the dead with Ananias and Sapphira. So this is just another individual by the name of Ananias. Came down with some elders with an attorney named Tertullus, and they brought charges to the governor against Paul. Verse 2. After Paul had been summoned, Tertullus began to accuse him, saying to the governor, summon Paul in, and here's what lawyers do. He says, I got some accusations. And realize he is a lawyer. And I want you to think about what Jesus had to say about a bunch of scribes and Pharisees and hypocrites and lawyers. And don't throw them all in the same bucket, but go, man, you're really good at holding to the law and going against what I want, what God wanted. You can read all through Matthew chapter 23 for more of those things. But here in order, Tertullus is here. He says, accuse him, since we have through you attained much peace. Once again, seems like if you're going to talk to the governor, you better say something nice first. And so that's what he does. You'll see Paul do the same thing, so don't look down your nose necessarily. He says, it's showing respect, which isn't that what we're supposed to do? To go, even though Ananias is corrupt, here's the lawyer. He says, he knows to show honor. Can we not show honor to kings and governors? And if we get away from that, who are we no longer submitting to? To the Lord. So we better be careful with what we say about kings and governors. Then he says, since we have through you attained much peace, and since by your providence reforms are being carried out for this nation. He says, you're really taking good care of us. Your provisions. Verse 3. We acknowledge this in every way and everywhere. We don't say anything bad about you no matter who we're talking to. Everywhere and every way, in every way. He says, most excellent Felix, with all thankfulness. I mean, we're so glad we're here, we can hardly believe it. We wouldn't say anything bad about you no matter where we were. Whew, I mean, it's like, you're not going to be able to grab him, he's going to be so buttered up. Then, verse 4, but, he says, that I may not weary you any further, I beg you to grant us by your kindness a brief hearing. He says, "For we have found this man a real pest, and a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Now we're getting down to the real deal. Notice what he brings up. He says, "I don't want to weary you. I'm just going to cut to the chase," is what we would say. He says, "If you'll just grant for us by your kindness a hearing," you almost feel like Tertullus is saying, "Just give us a few moments and we'll have this all dealt with. I can tell you the truth, you don't have to listen to the other side." But, verse 5, how do they see Paul? He is a pest. Now, I'm going to put this on a creature terminology for a second. What do you do with pests in your house? You kill them. What was their mindset with Paul? He's a real pest and we're going to kill him. That was the plan. He doesn't bring that part up. And I'm not saying that Tertullus was part of that 40 plus, but anyway. He says, "And a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world." That sounds like a pretty big blanket statement. Now, I want you to see how Tertullus is cutting his own case. Because he's saying, you know what, everywhere you go in the world, this man stirs up dissension. Here's the problem with this lawyer. So you should be able to talk to any Jew from any town across the Roman Empire, and they'll be able to tell you how much of a pest he is. Well, what's the problem with that if you're in a court case? If you can find some Jew from some town in the Roman province who doesn't agree with that, what have you said about yourself? I'm a liar. Well, just sharing that with you. So, he says, "Stirs up dissensions among all the Jews throughout the world, and a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes." Now, if you've noticed it through the book of Acts, we've seen this even way back in Acts chapter 3. You remember whenever Peter and John were going toward the temple and the lame beggar is being carried along and he's healed? And after he's healed, the people rush at Peter and John, and they talk about Jesus of Nazareth. And that's kind of a common thing that they would say. So how did people start to see what they were doing? They were a sect, right? Now, I want you to think, can you name any other sects, S-E-C-T-S, that were around during the time of the book of Acts? Okay, the Essenes would have been around, but they're not mentioned in Acts. Pharisees are a sect. Sadducees are a sect. Zealots are another group. They wanted to overthrow government. There's even, beyond that, Herodians that are a group. They're the religious folks who are really ingrained in government. And you realize Sadducees don't believe in the Spirit or resurrection or angels. And you go, can that happen today? Are there people nowadays who believe but go, well, the Spirit really doesn't do anything? You think about Pharisees, people who are so dead set on holding to law that they forget about what is really intended to be there spiritually. You think about Herodians, even present day, we pay so much attention to the governing things that we forget who reigns and who's in real control, and to just rest there. And you start to look through those things back there and you go, man, this sounds like familiarity. This doesn't sound like outdated things. And to go, here's a group of the Nazarenes. Do you remember what Nazareth means? Because that's where Jesus was raised. It makes perfect sense when you hear it. Dedicated. Dedication. Because if you were a Nazarene, you were dedicated to the Lord. Now, how did that go in Nazareth? What was its reputation? Remember what Nathanael said about it? Can any good thing come out of Nazareth? Like, you sure you got the right guy? Which tells you what happened in the town itself. But Nazareth literally meant dedication. And who have you ever read about is more dedicated to God than Jesus? No one. No wonder that's where he was raised. And to be raised that dedicated in the midst of a place that wasn't very good. And it goes to show you, there's no excuses when it comes to lacking dedication toward God. It's not a product of not having people around that are moving in the right direction. I can't say, well, you know, God, it's pretty tough here. He says, have you seen my son? Realize, it's possible. Now, but it got kind of nailed down as this is just another sect. It's a subgroup within the Jewish culture, and that's the way they talk about it. Paul is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. Now, verse 6. He says, and he even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. He says, now once again, is that what he was doing? If you remember a few chapters back, he's in the temple, and he went there. He says he was going to pay the way for these men who are going to keep a vow. And things were just fine for 7 days until these Jews from Asia showed up. And then everything went haywire because they saw a guy in town, remember this? They made an assumption. And because of that assumption, all of a sudden they said, well, we saw you with this man from Asia in town, and we just assumed that you took him into the temple to desecrate it, which of course was completely, totally false. And once again, isn't it stupid? Here's Tertullus bringing up the same stupid inaccuracies right before the governor. He must not think much of the governor to basically already cut his own throat twice so far through his introductory remarks. Then, he says, even tried to desecrate the temple, and then we arrested him. We wanted to judge him according to our own law. But Lysias, the commander, came along, and with much violence took him out of our hands, ordering his accusers to come before you. Man, did this guy get any more stupid? I mean, it just goes to show. He says, we want to judge him according to our law. And if they would have judged him according to their law, what would have happened with Paul? They'd have killed a Roman citizen. How do you think the governor is going to care about that? He says, what are you doing? Then, of course, he says, Lysias the commander, which Claudius Lysias, referring back all the way back there. So you know you're dealing with the same commander all the way through. He says, came along with much violence, took him out of our hands. And man, he had to fight us off tooth and nail. We were going to take him down. And you go, you can take down an innocent man? Oh, you're sounding real smart. He says, ordering his accusers to come before you. He says, and he's the one who said you had to come before you. Does it sound like he's excited to be there now? What was so buttery at the beginning is now turning into bitter, isn't it? Then he says, by examining him yourself concerning all these matters, you'll be able to ascertain the things of which we accuse him. He says, you just examine him, you'll find out that we're totally right, and you'll just hand him right over. Well, if you notice verse 9, he says, the Jews also joined in the attack, asserting that these things were so. And about that time, everybody else says, yeah, he's right. We saw him do these things. No, they didn't. Whatever they said, I don't know. But you notice they pipe in, like, he's not the only one who thinks this way. Then, here's where things take a turn. If you think about it, even from the book of Proverbs, a man is thought to be correct until the other side is heard. And I would encourage you in life, whenever somebody tells you what's going on, don't be too quick. He says, if it's something that really needs attention, make sure you find out the other side of the coin. Or else you'll find yourself in some real hot water really fast. And the fire will get turned up pretty quick. And you may find yourself working in a direction that is against God rather than with God. So, here's Felix, verse 10. He says, when the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded. So, Paul, you have anything you'd like to say? But all he does is just nod his head at him, which is kind of unique. And Paul understood, okay, it's my turn. And if you notice, Paul doesn't yell whenever they're making up all these false things. He doesn't say, that's not right, you're wrong, you're lying. He just let him speak. How many times in our lives can we learn from that? What people are saying we know, well, that's not right, that's not true, that's not the way it really happened. And go, just let them talk. If anybody really needs to find out the truth, they'll come and they'll ask. He says, or I'll be given an opportunity. Can we not trust the Lord to take care of us even through difficulty? Now, here's verse 10. He says, when the governor had nodded for him to speak, Paul responded, knowing that for many years you have been a judge to this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Now, historically, Felix became governor around AD 51 or 52, somewhere through there. And this kind of thumbprint on time is somewhere between 54 and 58 AD when these events happen. So he's been governor for a while. He's been listening to cases. He's not new on the block here. And he says, I'm so glad you're here. And if you ever have an opportunity, you don't want a judge that just came out of college. You want someone who's been around long enough to understand people and to understand the law and to understand justice and truth. That's what to pray for. Now, here's what God has provided. Then, he says, I know you've been a judge for a long time. He says, many years. He says, I cheerfully make my defense. He says, this doesn't bother me at all. Verse 11. Since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. Do you remember, now I don't know whether Felix knew this, but do you remember where Paul was before he went to Jerusalem? Caesarea, the same place that we're at right now, 12 days later. Why would Paul bring that up? Think about what Tertullus has said. And they didn't even want him to leave.
They claimed that he had caused trouble all over the world, and that's why they were accusing him.
And they go, 12 days ago, did you notice any upheaval in the world here in your own town? Now, Paul doesn't bring all that up, but I want you to see, when you find people who are deceptive and lies, the one thing they're going to do, they're just in fear of is what? What if the truth comes out? Now, he says, since you can take note of the fact that no more than 12 days ago I went up to Jerusalem to worship. And I maybe should have pointed this before. When he starts using come up or go down to Jerusalem, remember, don't think north, south, east, or west. Think about traveling by land. Jerusalem is always uphill. It's at the top. He says, when you're going from Jerusalem, it's always down to wherever else you're going. So, he makes a statement. He says, I went up to Jerusalem to worship, verse 12. Neither in the temple, nor in the synagogues, nor in the city itself did they find me carrying on a discussion with anyone or causing a riot. Felix, make them prove it. He says, whether we're talking about at the temple, and I want you to notice, he even goes even further. He says, not at the temple, not at the synagogues, which there would have been a whole bunch of those in Jerusalem. He says, even just in the city itself. Ask them where this riot was. Ask them where it all started. And go ahead and just ask them who started it. Because it wasn't Paul. Now, here he lays it out. Verse 13. Nor can they prove to you the charges of which they now accuse me. He says, make them prove it. They can't. And that's why Paul says, I'm cheerful to tell you the truth. It doesn't bother me at all. Then, verse 14, but this I admit to you. He says, but this I'm going to tell you up front. He says that according to the way which they call a sect, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. Now, if you go back earlier in the book of Acts, you remember what they called the followers of Jesus?
Yes, that's real loud.
Those of the way, right? And if you remember, that came from John chapter 14, where Jesus told his 11, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father but by me or through me. And so that kind of stuck with them. And what a good thing to stick. To go, yeah, Jesus is the only way to the Father. It's the only way home. Sometimes we need to have that ingrained a little bit more conviction. He says, but according to the way which they call a sect. Now, they call it just a subset. What does Paul know? It's the one and only way. It's not one of many. It's not, well, there's multiple ways to get to the Father. He says, one way. He says, they call it a sect. He says, I do serve the God of our fathers. Now, later on, if we get there in 24, you'll find out that Felix's own wife, Drusilla, is a Jewess. I'm not sure whether Felix is a Jew or not. It doesn't seem to be the case. But to understand, his wife would care about these things. And in any marriage, what your wife cares about, you're going to care about too. Then, if you love her. Now, if you notice it here, he says, I do serve the God of our fathers, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. What is Paul communicating to Felix?
He believes a lot of the same things they do.
He says, I trust God's word. I trust what is in the law. I trust the prophets. I'm not some rebel who's going out on his own. He says, then, and notice it says, believing everything that is in accordance with the law and that is written in the prophets. He says, I take it all, because who is the law going to lead people to? It was made to be a tutor to lead them to Jesus in Galatians. Then, he continues, verse 15. Having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves. He says, even my accusers cherish a relationship with God. He says, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. Now, who didn't believe in a resurrection? Sadducees. Like even Ananias. And so you come to see, he says, this is their hang-up. He says, having a hope in God, which these men cherish themselves, that there shall certainly be a resurrection of both the righteous and the wicked. He says, it's coming. And I want you to think about, to Felix, this may be a bit of a revelation. I don't know. But you're going to find out maybe further in the chapter, he's pretty curious about these things. But maybe for a bad motive. Then, he says, verse 16, in view of this, I also do my best to maintain always a blameless conscience before both God and before men. He says, I don't violate my conscience. And that matters before men, and it also matters before God. More so before God. He says, I'm going to do what I know to be right. And isn't that what a blameless conscience is? If it's right, that's what I'm going to do. Because what happens whenever you know the right thing to do, but you don't do it? What happens in your conscience? How do you feel? Guilty. You can't be blameless. He says, here he is. He says, if you understand the whole thing, you'll come to find out I'm blameless in how I handle these things. Verse 17. Now after several years I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. After several years, and now he's going back to the story that they're talking about that took place in Jerusalem. Then, some 12 days before this. He says, to my nation to bring offerings, verse 18, in which they found me occupied in the temple, having been purified. He purified himself, even with water. He says, without any crowd or uproar. He says, and there was no trouble whatsoever. And if you go back and get the facts, it's 7 days. From the time he goes in there, cleanses himself, pays the vow for these other men, or pays the price for these other men to keep his vow, 7 days. And then notice what he brings up, the rest of verse 18. He says, there were some Jews from Asia who ought to have been present before you and to make accusation if they should have anything against me. He says, they're the ones you need to talk to. He says, you need to ask them. He says, if you really want to get down to the bottom of this, he says, they're the ones. They're the ones who caused the riot. They're the ones that caused the stir. They're the ones who worked off of assumptions. They're the ones that you need. Then, he says, verse 20, or else let these men themselves tell what misdeed they found when I stood before the council. He says, maybe you can just ask them what happened at the council meeting at the Sanhedrin. He says, just ask them. See what they find out. Because remember what caused the big stir at the council meeting? Remember what Paul brought up? Resurrection of Jesus. Oh. Yeah, kill him. No, that's not what Felix is going to say. He says, just ask them. They'll tell you. Then verse 21. He says, other than for this one statement which I shouted out while standing among them, for the resurrection of the dead, I am on trial before you today. He says, and this is why I'm here. He says, I'm standing here because of the rebellion in the hearts of the Jews against the resurrection of the dead. Against these Sadducees who don't even believe that resurrection is possible. Apparently they don't believe all that the fathers wrote in the law and the prophets. Because Elijah, God used him to raise the dead. Elisha, God used him to raise the dead. Why not here? And you realize this is just what Paul's putting forward. Very simple. Paul doesn't yell it out. Verse 22. But Felix, having a more exact knowledge about the way. Oh, how convenient. Convenient's not the right word, is it? What is it? It's the providence of God that all of a sudden here Paul is being brought before someone who actually has a good understanding of the way. Just by being governor, you learn what people think, whether you agree with it or not. He says, you have a more excellent knowledge about the way. He says, put them off, saying, when Lysias the commander comes down, I will decide your case. What was Felix waiting for? Lysias. He says, he's the commander. He's the chiliarch. He says, when he shows up, we'll do this again. We'll reconvene. In other words, there's a continuance. And come back next. Verse 23. He says, then he gave orders to the centurion for him to be kept in custody and yet have some freedom, and not to prevent any of his friends from ministering to him. He says, take him into protective custody for his sake, not because he's done anything wrong. And on top of that, he says, let him have some freedom, and don't prevent any of his friends from coming and serving him. And you know one of his friends that's right there in town from 12 days ago. Philip the evangelist. Because if you remember, that's where Paul had stayed, at his house with his 4 daughters. And you go, look at the way the Lord provides. Now, here he is. There's been a continuance granted, and since it's just right on time, next time we come together, we'll finish out chapter 24. Now remember, next week we won't meet because it's the schools are out next week. So the next time we meet together will be in April, the first Tuesday in April, and it'll also be our luncheon, so keep that in mind. All right. Have a great week.